All right, so hi everyone. I see folks are slowly trickling in here. Folks are transitioning from the previous sessions that they were in to this one. So as folks come into our session, I want to give everyone a warm welcome. My name is Jessie Hernandez Reyes. I'm a higher education policy analyst here at the Education Trust. And before we get started and I introduce our three awesome panelists, I want to give space for folks to leave in the chat here on our platform their name, where they're joining us from, and the organization that they are with today. We are excited to see everyone who's in the room. So before we get started, also as well, I wanted to mention that if you have any questions, you could also drop them in the chat. We will do our best to address them towards the end of the session. All right, so now that that has been said, I will give a brief background on our session today. So research has shown time and time again that consistent access to food, nutritious food, that is necessary for all students to reach their full potential. And it is also crucial for education equity. However, too many students in the United States, specifically in K through 12 and higher education, don't have sufficient access to nutritious food. Pre-pandemic, the numbers around this issue were alarming. It was estimated that around 30% of college students were food insecure, and those numbers have only skyrocketed with the onset of the pandemic. When having this conversation around food insecurity, we also have to consider who our typical college student is as we have this conversation. So today's college student, they tend to be a little bit older than what folks typically think of. So the average college student is around 26 years of age. They tend to be enrolled in school part-time. And specifically, when we are looking at this with a racial equity lens and we focus on students of color and students from low income backgrounds, these students tend to work also while they are enrolled in school. So they work about 30 or more hours to make ends meet. They also tend to be the first in their families to go to college, and they tend to live on campus or at home with their families. And as I gave this landscape around food insecurity and our students, our federal and state systems have not kept up with the support that students need around nutrition equity. And so today we're really thrilled to be having our three awesome panelists in this conversation because we here at EdTrust are advocates in making sure that all students have equitable access to food. And so I'll go ahead and introduce our three panelists. But before that, I actually want to pull up our learning objectives for this session. And let's see if our colleagues here are able to pull that up. Awesome. So these are our goals for today's session. Overall, we just want to be able to leave this session with some advocacy points for our state advocates that are joining us here today, and also for our federal advocates that are present in the room. And again, another quick reminder, if you have any questions during today's session for our panelists, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will answer them at the end of today's session. And so with that being said, I'll go ahead and introduce our three awesome panelists. So today we're joined by Dr. Julia Wolfson. Dr. Julia Wolfson is an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she examined key individual, environmental, and policy factors that influence food choices, diet quality, and food security. Then we also have the honor of having Delegate Danica Roem here today. Delegate Danica Roem represents the 13th District of the Virginia House of Delegates as the first out and seated transgender state legislator in American history. During her first two terms in office, the governor of Virginia has signed 23 of Delegate Roem's bills into law, including 8 to prevent school meal debt shaming and 3 to protect LGBTQ Virginians. And then last but certainly not least is Jessica Rosario. Jessica Rosario is a higher education advocate and youth organizer at Swipe Out Hunger, a leading nonprofit addressing hunger among college students. They promote on-campus solutions, policy and advocacy pathways, and student empowerment practices to address student hunger. So again, thank you so much to all three of our panelists for being here. We're going to go ahead and start our discussion. So I'm actually going to start with Dr. Wolfson here today. So Dr. Wolfson, I want to start with you. So you and your team at Johns Hopkins recently published a study that really made news that links food nutrition and student outcomes, particularly college graduation. Can you tell us a little bit more about this study and why your team decided to focus on this and what you found?
Sure, thanks so much. And I just also want to say thanks for highlighting the issue of food insecurity on college campuses. We wanted to look at this because it's well known in the field of public health that access to good, nutritious food and being able to experience food security is a key social determinant of health that has wide-ranging implications. And there's been quite a bit of research about food insecurity on college campuses that has shown that the experience of food insecurity is associated with poor health, poor academic performance, graduation rates, mental health, higher rates of depression, lots of different multidimensional adverse outcomes associated with food insecurity during college. But that key word there is associated because a lot of this work has been concurrent or cross-sectional in nature, where we're looking at people experiencing food insecurity now and what they're experiencing now. And there's been very little research looking at long-term effects of food insecurity during college. So what we were able to do with this current study is look at a group of about 1,600 college students from way back in 1999 through 2003, and then follow them for the next 18 years through 2017. So we can see what their trajectories look like and what the potential long-term outcomes are from that experience of food insecurity during their college years. And this is really important because you really can't make any causal statements without being able to look at people over a period of time, right? So what we found was pretty shocking in the magnitude of the effects. We looked at these 1,600 students, and we found that for those who experienced food insecurity while they were in college, they were 43% less likely to graduate with any degree at all. And they were also less likely to graduate with a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree, 61% less likely to graduate with a graduate degree. And this is at any point. So, this accounts for did they go back to school later at some point? This accounts for their full educational trajectory over the next 18 years. And of course, this has huge implications because higher education in this country is a really important pathway out of poverty. It's a pathway towards economic mobility, and the ability to go to college and also graduate with a degree that you intended to get is really, really critical. And I'll also highlight in the study, we also looked at differential effects between first-generation students and non-first-generation students. And we found that the effects were even more stark for those first-generation students. So first-generation students who were also experiencing food insecurity during college, less than half of them actually graduated at any point during the next 18 years. So that's really important when we think about disparities, but also the ways that we need to think about addressing, mitigating, and preventing food insecurity among college students today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Wolfson. I think it's really impactful that you all were able to conduct this study over such a long term to see the long-term effects of how food insecurity impacts college students, right? And particularly here at EdTrust, we have a focus on students from low-income backgrounds and students of color. And like I said in the introduction, a lot of them tend to be first-gen students, right? And so really pulling that out of this data is very, very important as we talk about these issues. And so I'll actually drop it over to Jessica because I want Jessica to share a little bit more about her work in advocacy around food insecurity for college students. So Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you. What are you seeing on the ground in terms of students and food insecurity? What are some of the biggest barriers that students have to having equitable access to nutritious food? And what are some ways that student advocates have pushed for both local and national changes around food insecurity?
Thank you. So I think as you mentioned, when we're thinking of college students, They're not just your average students who are coming straight out of high school. Some take time off. They are their parents coming back to school. They're veterans coming back to school. They're people who have found that, that degree is essential if they want to move up in a position or in their life. And food insecurity isn't just about the age. It sees no age. It sees, not, it doesn't matter where you're coming from, but more about like the resources that are available. I won't say privilege, I'll say resources. So I think that's why we look at it through an equitable lens. In our work, when I talk about the work I've done in New York, specifically in New York City, when we're talking about the largest public university system in the United States, which is CUNY, where I have gone to Queensborough Community College, to John Jay College of Criminal Justice. We're seeing that the barriers are often with the food pantries. They don't have enough food, or it's just non-perishable items. We're seeing that there are no refrigerators for things that are not just non-perishable. We have free breakfast and lunch programs, which are great. Those are essential programs that we have in our colleges, in some of them and not all. But what I saw when I started to go to those programs were that sometimes you'd go early and you'd make it on time, and you'd be able to leave with breakfast right before class, so that you have the energy to pay attention, the energy to know what questions to ask, what assignments are coming up. But then sometimes you go, or more people hear about it, and I know that sounds horrible, but when we get the word out about these programs, they kind of run out, and you'd go back and the food would be gone, and they said there's nothing else that we can do. Often there are contracts with the schools and meal swipes, and sometimes the food prices will increase. We saw in some schools that actually they were literally starving their students by increasing the prices on meals in the cafeteria, but decreasing the portion sizes, which if you think about it, they're starving students. And this is before the pandemic. So we've seen after the pandemic and during it how horrible it has been, how long the lines have been with these community resources, which we're so grateful that they're open, the food banks, and the ways that people have shown up for their own communities, even if you yourself aren't facing food insecurity. But for students, it's running from class to class and not knowing where your next meal is coming from. It's running from class to class to your job, then going home and maybe having other responsibilities. And when it comes to often people with families or parents, you're choosing whether or not, you have expensive textbooks and other needs, transportation and other things that you need for just that are essential. And aside from that, whether or not you're going to choose to have a meal or give it to a family member, whether or not you can really buy that snack, you can go to the vending machine. It's the access to healthy, nutritious, and also enough food to make you full so you can get through the day. So it's not, it's more of an issue of how do we get the information to people who need it? How do we make sure that the resources are available? How do we make sure that there is a responsibility being taken into account by schools themselves, by the state themselves? So when we talk about Swipe Out Hunger, we started the Meal Swipe program in California at UCLA. And that's where students could donate their meal swipes, their unused meal swipes, to other students who needed them. And that kind of spiraled into how can we create greater change in addressing college food insecurity? Because I think that there's a lot of amazing work being done in K through 12, or when you think of the word hunger, you're thinking of a starving polar bear or a child who needs a meal. But it's also just greater than that. It's a community need at any age by anyone. But there is a lot of need by college students. And some of the work that we're doing is around the Hunger Free Campus Bill, which I have to have it on the side because it's been passed in California and New Jersey and Maryland and Minnesota. And we're trying to get into other states, but we're trying to get it passed in New York. And that would allocate $10 million to colleges that are taking on the responsibility of addressing food insecurity in their school. So it does demand that, they take into account, hey, we have this issue. If you are designated a hunger-free campus, that means you have a food pantry, you are providing SNAP resources, providing SNAP enrollment opportunities. That's something that we've done at CUNY through Swipe Out Hunger, is a one-on-one program where there's a team of navigators who are students who are trained in SNAP enrollment, and to find resources in communities where students can actually be connected to a navigator. And I've been a navigator before in the spring semester, and we help you with your SNAP enrollment one-on-one once we find out whether or not you qualify. And a lot of students don't qualify, which is why it's important to have those resources to other connections, to other food banks or other community resources that are available in their designated neighborhoods through our community engagement. And we're able to actually have relationships with other people providing those resources for students. And so in addition to having that CUNY program, having something like a task force where students are on there and they can speak for themselves, and we're not speaking for students, that they can also be there to speak for themselves and the needs of their peers. And through that program, once they meet this designation that would make them a hunger-free campus, they'd be able to apply for the grant to continue that work through that $10 million. And that covers public and private schools, because a lot of people ask, well, why private schools? There are still a lot of first-generation students, a lot of students of color, a lot of international students who need those resources. Going to a private school does not make you exempt from needing essential resources. But through my own on-the-ground work with talking to students about the Hunger-Free Campus, I've seen there are students starting movements on their campus to expand their food pantries. There are students who are running their own food distribution sites through churches or through like YMCA programs. They're able to make that connection themselves. And I think what's most important is that we are being understanding. We are destigmatizing asking for need, especially as we're still getting out of the pandemic, that we're becoming more comfortable having these conversations and saying, well, I experienced that in college, and not letting it be just something that happens, because it shouldn't happen. Hunger just shouldn't happen. We can't go throughout the day. It's not healthy. It's not better for our wellness, but that we're taking care of ourselves and showing up for the needs of our communities, and talking about it more, which is why I'm so happy to be here and to hear from all of you on what we're doing to really tackle this great issue.
Thank you so much, Jessica. You gave us so much there. You talked about the competing responsibilities of students, right? Nutrition is just one thing they have to worry about in their daily lives as students, right? But also just the really great advocacy efforts that have been going on both at the state level and then at the national level. So focusing on this hunger-free campus bill, right? That's been, as you said, passed in several states, attempting to be passed in other states. And I know Delegate Rome can talk a little bit about that coming up next. And it's also just really admirable that students are also taking this into their own hands. But unfortunately, we also want to see movement around our state and our federal level so that students don't have to be taking this as an onus of the work that they have to do. So, all right. So with that being said, I want to go ahead and pass the mic over to Delegate Roam. So Delegate Roam, in your work in Virginia, you've worked to break down some of the barriers that we just addressed for college students around accessing food. In particular, we know you've introduced HJ 558, which is a student meal donation program, and HB 1820, which makes enrolling in SNAP easier for college students. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work on these issues?
Sure. Thank you so much, Essie. So first, I just want to say thank you so much to the incredible advocates on this panel, because your work is so inspiring. I love what you're doing here. And actually, when I was introducing the resolution for the swipes, I had actually gone directly to the swipehunger.org website to, basically help me basically figure out, some of the right language for that. So what we attempted to do with that last year was basically just have a request. And so basically, I'll just even read to you what it would be. It was just going to say that each baccalaureate public institution of higher education in the Commonwealth be requested to establish a student meal donation program by which any enrolled student who has purchased a meal plan may donate any meal on such plan to the program, and any enrolled student with demonstrated food insecurity may apply to the program to redeem a donated meal at a meal plan eligible on-campus dining location or food bank located on campus in accordance with applicable state health regulations. Each baccalaureate public institution of higher education shall submit to the Division of Legislative Automated Services an executive summary and report on its progress in the meeting with the request no later than November 30th, 2021, blah, blah, blah. So the reason that I highlight that is we senior leadership, basically like, within our caucus, more or less, they decided that they want to really focus on my K through 12 program. And so, we've now passed 8 of my bills, as you were saying earlier, to basically prevent school meal debt shaming, and to even in one bill, by requiring eligible schools participate in the federal community eligibility provision, we're guaranteeing free school meals to up to 109,000 more Virginia students. We also had my bill that requires participation among eligible schools in the federal after-school meals program. Sorry, I have a friend who's joining us today. That's my cat, Melinda. So anytime I talk on camera, she's always here. So anyway, though, in my federal after-school meals program, by requiring participation in that for eligible schools, that will actually have after-school meals being provided at another 600 schools, 600 something schools throughout the Commonwealth, which is another huge deal, right? So they also, senior leadership took a constitutional question, more or less, about the request that I had for the resolution. We more or less have an unresolved issue that we have to work out with it. But I've reached out directly to some of our campuses, just throughout the Commonwealth, like Old Dominion University, James Madison University, George Mason University. And we're basically trying to figure out a few things, which is number one, to get them to just do it themselves. The best thing they could do, even though Virginia is very much a Dillon rule state, there is nothing in the Code of Virginia that would prohibit a college or university from establishing a food, a food pantry, for example. There's nothing in the Code of Virginia that would basically say that they can't have, meal swipes or whatever. What we're trying to do, more or less, by having legislation about this, and even just making a request before we were going to make, the formal bill for and everything, with the, as I saw in the Maryland legislation, there's $150,000 annual appropriation that was attached to it. Before we even were trying to do that, we just wanted to really get them understanding that this is what we're trying to get them to do, and we would like them to do that. I am very adamant that when it comes to especially House bills, so basically something that's called HB and then fill in the blank. You don't use House bills to start a conversation. You use that to enact public policy, because those have to be signed by the governor. I'm very adamant about legislators not just taking the easy way out, saying like, oh, well, I filed this bill to start a conversation, and some of my work here is done. I hate seeing that stuff. I think it's a cop out. With resolutions that are non-binding and they don't go to the governor, this is the avenue where you can have requests, where you can actually get agencies to administratively implement things, for example. And in this case, starting the conversation with this bill really does one of two things, or does really two things. Number one, in my case, is it allows me to work with my senior leadership to make sure that I've got a bill that's ready for prime time, so that by the time I want to request that $150,000, this being a first attempt doesn't get defeated. So basically, in this case, they just didn't call up the bill, because they're like, okay, we want you to just continue working on this legislation. I'm like, okay, that's fine. And so come January, as long as the people of the 13th district in about 2 weeks, a little less than that, decide that they want to keep me on as their state delegate, I will certainly be filing legislation, in this regard, one way, shape, or form. And especially because we have such good precedent now out of 4 different states. And I can also shame my colleagues by saying Maryland did this before us. They should never do anything before we do. And we should be better at them in everything that we do. Little Virginia nationalism never hurt anyone in terms of, feeding hungry kids and adults. So that's big. Now, as for the other bill that we passed, this one was basically regarding the federal restaurant meals program. And so what this bill did was it directs the Department of Social Services to participate in the restaurant meals program of SNAP. And the bill, it requires the department to develop and implement a plan to begin its by actually January 1st of this year, which they've now done and which everything's now into effect. So basically with this is the most obvious bill in the world that we very much should have passed with a lot more bipartisan support than it got. It did get some. It had one Republican in the House vote for it, and it had, I think, 7 Republicans in the Senate vote for it. And I couldn't understand at the time. I was like, why on earth is this not, well, like, why is this not more bipartisan? Like, because they weren't raising objections to me in committee over this. They weren't raising objections on the House floor. They just decided in block, all but one of them, except for Delegate Brewer, just decided in block to vote against it. And so then when I started talking to members about it individually afterward, I was like, this is a voluntary program that restaurants are not forced to do. You're not going to see Ruth Chris or their equivalent, saying like, oh yes, we're going to have SNAP benefits available for the porterhouse today. That's not how this works. We're talking about very often. We're talking about having like a Sheetz or a Wawa, where you have someone who walks in, and right now, well, before we had passed this bill, a typical SNAP recipient would be able to purchase a cold sandwich from the refrigerator or grab a bag of chips, but they couldn't ask for a prepared hot meal from behind the counter, even if that was a healthier option, for example. And also, it's not our job as legislators to police the eating habits of people who are, people who have EBT cards. That's their decision, and that's their responsibility to make those decisions. And so when someone wants, what one of the fundamental lack of understandings I think people have is, number one, food deserts very much exist, and they very much exist even in populated areas where people have, several miles to go between, actual grocery stores, and they don't always have cars, they don't always have whatever. And so sometimes the CVS up the street is actually the closest thing that they're going to have to the grocery store. Sometimes the grocery store has closed in town, and what's left is, getting an MTO or, getting a hoagie or something, from whether it's, from Sheetz or whether it's from Wawa, having some sort of meal. And the last thing on this is, as an Italian stepmom, I very much take objection to the idea that hot meals are considered a luxury item. It just, my family, every Sunday night, my entire childhood into adulthood, Sunday nights when we have giant hot meal together, it's like Italian style. It's the most glorious thing you ever had, which is which is wonderful. Not everyone has been able to have that experience, right? But to me, that's a part of life. A hot meal around with family is just a part of what you do. And so with my partner, my stepdaughter, one of the things that we do, we have, like pizza movie night, right? So on Fridays. And so, we'll just have pizza together, watch movie, whatever. To me, this is about, like a family experience. And at the same time, it's also about dealing with day-to-day hunger, because not every person has immediate access to a grocery store, and not every person should be shamed and, quite frankly, no people should be shamed and stigmatized because of their income when they're just trying to eat. And part of trying to eat means that, look, if you see a veggie sub that's at Sheetz, which I get, probably about every other week, that's fine. Go eat it. It's what's the complaint? I couldn't understand. And so once I started talking to members and explaining this is entirely voluntary, restaurants receive it themselves, and there's a huge incentive from the restaurants to do this because they get immediate money in the bank. Like every time that card's swiped, there's no question about whether someone's overdrawn their credit card limit or whatever. That card swipe, that money transfers. It goes from the federal government over. So just, we already had the infrastructure in place to be able to, to basically set it up. And so, the fiscal impact statement for it came back at like $50,000 to $100,000. But the Department of Services told the Division of Legislative Services, these are obviously different groups and agencies here, they said, well, actually, we'll be able to just absorb that via our, annual budget, appropriation. We'll be able to make it work. And what was so nice was having an agency in the Department of Social Services that really wanted to do it. And they were just like, yes, we can absolutely do this. And so I think that's the last thing that a lot of people take for granted and that they don't necessarily think about when they're casting a vote for state government, especially at a governor's level and you're dealing with executive agencies, is having people who want the agencies to be able to fulfill their mission actually being in charge of those agencies. It's a huge difference versus putting people in place who fundamentally don't believe that agencies should exist in the first place, or they're not committed to the mission of the agency. We're fortunate right now in the administration that we have that all our agencies really are stacked with people who are genuinely committed to fulfilling the missions of those agencies. And I really need to emphasize that to people, that just like understanding about the role that those department heads really play when we're trying to eliminate hunger like this.
Thank you so much, Delegate Rome. I think, those points of conversation, it's important to hone in. This not only just affects students, as you said, but it affects entire families, right? And again, when we think of, our students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, this issue goes more beyond themselves. Entering college might be a way that they're able to access food, but it often presents so many barriers. And students can become food insecure because of the costs associated with college and everything that just comes with it. So definitely points of conversation to take away from our session. But I'm going to open it up actually with a general question for the group. Now that we've given a little bit of background on each of the panelists' work, why is it necessary to view this work through an equity lens, primarily a racial and socioeconomic equity lens? And any of our panelists can go ahead and jump in.
I like to discuss that with my staff bill, because the origin of it was very unusual. You wouldn't have thought about it, but it very much applies. One of the advocates who brought this to my attention was actually talking about how this actually affects LGBTQ young people because they are disproportionately more likely to experience homelessness. And when they are kicked out of their homes after they come out, very often you find a number of situations that happen. Number one, if you're experiencing homelessness in regard to the SNAP bill, the hot meals program, that you do not in that moment have access to a stove or even a microwave, or even a hot plate. Number two, you were never taught those culinary skills to begin with, because simply put, asking for help, asking for that advice or anything like that, you are already in a hostile situation to begin with. And number three, you have a lot of just young people who just never had the opportunity to figure this stuff out for themselves, and they don't have the access to opportunity there. And so because they've been kicked out, because they're on their own, and they're like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to get a hot meal? This is a sort of bill that bridges that gap and at least allows them to be able to focus on a few other things that be on their belly, when they have those immediate concerns. So that was very much, part of a equity lens on this. And also, given that this is more or less really intended, the STEM program, obviously, it can be, for young people. I think it goes so universal that for a lot of people who are in colleges, especially, if you are finding yourself having to be completely financially independent on your own, whether you wanted to or not, and you were in day-to-day survival mode, and you're not necessarily thinking about long-term, you're thinking about how do I get through today? How do I get through this week? As opposed to long-range planning. And a full refrigerator is sometimes, taken for granted by a lot of people. I think this is the sort of thing where you have to look at the intersectionality there of age, of class, and especially for a lot of immigrant communities and for communities of color, that if they have not been granted the opportunity, the same equal opportunity that someone like I had, then you have to look at what do we do to close that gap. And by the way, today, just a quick plug-in, today in Manassas Park, at Manassas Park Middle School at 4:45, they have their monthly free market where basically I have my constituents show up. They pick up free groceries that are donated right there at Manassas Park Middle School. I love that program so much. I've actually been able to donate to it. I've get to meet a lot of people there. Fortunately, I won't be able to stop by today because I got too much of my schedule. But just I love the fact that we actually have people in food pantries on college campuses at UC, for example, who are donating those items and really stepping up and understanding that food insecurity often comes with other types of insecurity, so that you'll have menstrual equity issues that you're dealing with, by the way, and that's part of a grocery program that they'll actually provide over at Manassas Park Middle School, and that a lot of the same people who experience issues in terms of hunger also have issues in terms of transportation, and having to bridge all those gaps together, you understand, okay, if we're going to really give equal opportunity to people, that does inherently mean we have to have an equitable lens in which we look at this, so that we can figure out who really needs the help and what can we do to close that gap.
Yeah, if I could follow on that, I think it's what Delegate Rome is really speaking to is that food is a basic human right, and the ability to not go hungry is a basic human right. And we haven't treated it as such in this country for a lot of different reasons that intersect with a lot of historical wrongs and systemic racism and a lot of other forms of discrimination that people deal with. And so there are a lot of really serious structural reasons that we need to focus on food through a lens of equity and in a really comprehensive and multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral and intersectional way. As Delegate Rome's saying, people, college students today are parents. They have a lot of different identities that they're also dealing with, right? And a lot of needs, like housing needs, transportation needs, academic resources needs, like a lot of things that they're balancing. And there are trade-offs that those students make every day in order to be able to feed themselves and house themselves and get to work and do their schoolwork. And Jessica could probably speak to this a lot better than I can. But, I think it is really important to think about the way that we all need to eat every single day, ideally multiple times a day. And there are a lot of reasons that have to do with structural inequalities and historic structural inequalities in this country that too many people are not able to do that. And the face of the people who are not able to do that very much reflects the current college student population. And I think that's a misconception that our policy landscape has not necessarily kept up with, because as Jessica was saying, we have an idea of like who this college student is, this like privileged person who's being supported by their parents and is off pursuing a college degree. And that's just simply not what college students look like today. And so the problems of food insecurity in America are the problems of college students in America.
I'd also add that looking at through the equity lens, there's also barriers with language, which we were able to tackle through something like the CUNY Navigator program. I myself have applied for SNAP. It's a multi-layered, multi-dimensional application that really looks to understand you, but also question whether or not you need the support or you need access to food, which you really, really do. And who would go through that whole application process if you really didn't need the support? Because I would not. It's a whole situation. And being able to fill the gap for being connected to students who speak Spanish, being able to talk them through the application, being on the phone and answering their questions about which bill do I send? How do I send it? The app isn't working, or I don't know why I haven't heard back yet. Being able to be there for another student really matters. And also, we don't talk about often a lot of people who maybe they live with their parents and their parents work jobs that don't receive paychecks. There aren't like clear, specific, connections to where they're getting this. You can't really document it. And you're being questioned on, where is the money coming from? Where's the income coming from? There's a lot of different things, and also kind of the stigma of, again, asking for help. At our schools, you can go and say, I need resources because I don't have access to food, and I'm hungry, all for whatever reason. And all school can really say is, SNAP is an option, and maybe we like have a food pantry, but they can't really like go through it with you. They can't say whether or not you actually qualify. They can't go that extra step, which I think we're filling the gap by providing these resources. But it really is about making sure that people don't have a fear of asking for help. And they're, whether it's housing or they need like a checkup or food, that it's a comfortable conversation, and that someone's looking out for them. And it doesn't feel like you're being questioned, or it's like you're not really like going to an office and being like, can I have help? And it's like, oh, well, we are very excited and very happy to be able to serve you. Like, how can we help you?
Definitely. And I think it's also important here at EdTrust, specifically on higher ed, we tend to look at our justice impacted students and also our undocumented students, right? So when we bring those identities into this conversation around the intersectionality of our students, even that can present a barrier, a student's identity. And if their parents are undocumented, or if they are, there are additional barriers in that sense, or hesitations to even ask about this type of information. So I appreciate very much every one of your responses. So I know we're cutting close to time. I do want to take a question or two from our audience. So I believe we have one so far in the chat. Rachel Presume, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, said having to prove one's level of need is a burden and additional barrier to accessing food. Beyond peer-to-peer support, are there other strategies to make it easier? What about automatic eligibility? Do any of our panelists want to help answer this question?
So just the one thing to keep in mind is that because SNAP is federally administered, that means we have federal rules that we have to play by. And so the very burdensome process that Jessica was discussing, while you might have some variation state to state in terms of how that state agency is run, the more or less basic formula is going to be, pretty consistent across the board. So it's just, that's the sort of thing that we have to bring to the House Agriculture Committee, for example. And I worked directly with Representative Abigail Spanberger, by the way, when we were eliminating the requirement from USDA that parents had to have their kids with them in order to pick up free meals for them during the pandemic. Especially during the early part last year, because you don't want to have to expose immunocompromised kids who couldn't be vaccinated to situations like that, right? And we got that change done, which was great. So one other thing though, I do want to mention here in terms of just basically breaking down that barrier to additional food. We had one of our colleges actually in Hampton Roads. They have a really good program, or one of the things that they do is they send out campus-wide alerts to people who sign up for them, to let them know anytime that there's catering for an event and there's leftover food afterward, they just send it and they say, hey, we have free food over at this basically this building in this room. And it'll be available for the next hour. Anyone who wants to stop by, come and get it. That immediately does a few things. Number one, it removes stigma entirely, because anyone who wants to be able to sign up for that can. Number two, it eliminates meal waste, which is personally offensive to me as an Italian woman. Like, eat your food, come on. And the third part of this is it's something that I believe is a precedent setter that we can also use in terms of, making sure that we have people who understand how a good, successful food program on a college campus is supposed to work. So that if you're going to include a food pantry, for example, or if you're going to have that, the swipe donations, for example, that you're looking at other successful programs on school, and chances are the same people who you talk to who established that, they're going to be of the right mindset where they're going to be able to tell you, oh, hey, if we work on it in this way, we're probably going to be able to get this done too.
Definitely. Any last comments on this question from our other two panelists?
I think something else we've seen, as I mentioned, they have like the free breakfast, like free lunch programs. Those are meals that came from the actual like cafeterias that they had just relocated part of because not all of the food that they make is actually being bought by students. And that was just relocated to another room where they were offering it to students. So I think that with student voices and advocacy, that's something that could come to your campus if you guys worked on it. And also something that our school at CUNY was doing, one of our schools, was somewhat of an online food pantry. They're still running it, where a student would like complete a Google form and they would receive kind of like, I mean, not that we like Amazon, but Amazon to your door, but with food from your school that any student was eligible for. And I'd be happy to talk through and make any connections if students were interested in taking on that program, if for anyone who was interested in learning more about their model. But from what we heard, when we were connected to students and maybe they weren't eligible for SNAP or they needed like immediate food, they were actually really happy with the program. They were getting their boxes. It was like a pretty, large box with like rice and some produce. If some schools are doing farming, that's another thing. John Jay would have like fresh produce that students would be able to pick up as well. I think there's a lot of programs that could be run again if you're using your voice, if you're contacting the right people with a strong message, and you are moving them into seeing like the need is always going to be there. The need is there, but lessening the need and making sure that you guys are raising your own stories.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Jessica. And last thing I will just say on that question is there have been federal proposals or bills that would tie completion of FAFSA around making sure what benefits students would be, I guess, eligible for. So there are also those proposals as well as a last advocacy point. So I know we've run now a minute over time, but I wanted to thank again all our panelists for this really wonderful session. I think some of our panelists would be open to connecting. So if they want to drop in their emails or contact information, we will have that there as well. So thank you again to everyone. I'll leave this room open just for a second so folks can capture folks' emails. But thank you all so much.